Composing with pianos, how to make realistic sounding piano melodies. So a few steps you can do. Emphasizing higher notes relative to lower notes, have a pattern when you're using articulations, and accentuate notes sparingly. So this is more of a thing not to do. Don't accentuate every bar. Mix them up as you go along. So let's take a look at what I mean by all of this. If we look at our piano roll and I were to play a melody in real life, we'll see how it shows up in our software. So how does this show up here? We can see a few things. First of all, we see that since I was holding down the pedal, every single note has been dragged on. There's no actual spacing in between them. So that's one thing. Secondly, we can see that there's the velocity changes. And third, we can see that the spacing is not on every bar, not on every beat. So this is what the results of playing live into your MIDI gives you. And this is good and it's bad at the same time. It's good because it's realistic. It's bad because this is hard to combine with other instruments. The timing is a little bit off. You can see it's not on every bar. If I wanted to have a violin accompany this, this is going to be hard to time map. I'm going to have to change this to something else, because how are you going to play at the same time that this plays? You'd have to keep getting faster and quieter as you go along. So here's some of the strengths and weaknesses of using software for composing. The strength is that you can combine notes really easily if you actually program them in. So let's look at a piano melody here. If I were to, what I've done here is I actually typed in the notes. I had a melody in mind, and you can see now everything is linear. Everything is exactly on the beat, every bar, but this is slightly less realistic in some ways to this. But the benefit of this is that if I wanted to have a violin, I can have another instrument come in at exactly that same moment. And I know that it's going to be in time. Everything is exactly in place. So what can you use this for? Well, you can use it for reference. You can understand that this is the melody I want, and I can see these notes. Generally, in this timing, I'm going to have to fix it up though. So I would take this melody and I would do something called quantizing it. And that's essentially a tool that comes with any piano roll. Your software may look slightly different, but essentially there'll be a feature that says quantizing. And when you quantize it, it's going to shift the positioning to being exactly on a timing beat rather than just randomly. You can see here it's just random. Now it's exactly on a timing spot. And this is the first thing you can do. It's going to make it sound a little more robot-y because it's on every beat, but it'll be easier to combine with other instruments. And once you do it with enough instruments, you don't really notice it so much, oddly enough. So that's one thing. You'll still have to move things around because it's not exactly perfect. The second thing is velocities. So this is what distinguishes a realistic sounding piano from a fake one, though, when you're combining it. These notes, for the most part, are the melody, because when I was playing in my right hand here, I was trying to emphasize these notes more than my left hand, because this is where the melody is. So this is where I wanted your ears to be focusing on. Whereas my left hand, I wanted to play that slightly quieter. The volume was lower. I was not accentuating this as much. Rather than, I don't want this to be the focus. I want this to be the focus. So I'm making this slightly louder than this hand when I'm playing live. So that's something we should try to do in the software. And that's very easy to do. We can take these notes that are in general higher, or at least this is where the melody happens to be. So I'm going to raise the volume of these slightly, at least if I were to be typing in these notes. And I can do this just by scrolling around with in FL Studio at least, by holding down the left Alt and scrolling with my mouse. And I can raise the volume of the melody, and I can reduce the volume of the chords. So that's one thing that's a really easy, quick fix. The second thing, after we've emphasize higher notes relative to lower notes is that if you're dealing with arpeggios, you can articulate with a pattern. So what have I done here with these articulations? Well, I've made sure that the higher notes are slightly louder. You can see these velocities are a little bit higher than these lower notes, which are actually the same. I could vary these up a little bit as well. But the key thing is that I want to point out is these higher notes are a little bit louder. These middle notes are a little bit lower, somewhere in the middle, and the lower notes are the quietest. If I were to have all of these exact same articulation, compared to so that's one thing you can do, is try to create some kind of pattern. In this case, since I'm going higher and then lower and then higher and then lower, I'm doing the same thing with my volume. Higher and then lower and higher and lower and so on. So when you're doing an arpeggio, consider articulating in some kind of flow, in some kind of sweeping motion, some kind of wavy change in volume, where one note is leading to another, and you're doing the same thing with the volume. So if I were to have notes here, I start louder, I have a gradual progression in volume, rather than I'm starting at one volume and I'm progressing as I go along. And I can do the same thing in software. So that's the second tip, is for arpeggios, articulate with a pattern. And the third one is to accentuate notes sparingly. You don't want to accentuate every bar. You want to mix up the articulations as you go along. And this is something more along the lines of what a beginner pianist will do rather than someone who's been playing a long time. If we were to be playing melodies and I were to accentuate every time I have a note versus not doing that, let me give you an example. This will be clear. So I'm going to, first of all, play it badly. Versus the way that is a little bit better sounding. What I'm making sure is I'm not accentuating every time the bar hits. So what do I mean by bar? This is a bar. 1 bar, 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars, 5 bars, 6 bars. If I were to emphasize the first note of each bar, meaning I make that note louder, how would that sound? That doesn't sound anywhere near as good as if we were not to accentuate that note as much. Might even want to accentuate that less than it is. But my key focus is that you don't want to have an accent at every single bar. Don't accentuate every bar, mix up the articulation as you go. So follow these 3 steps. Emphasize notes higher relative to lower notes. Your right hand, if you're playing a real piano, will be the melody in general. So that's the volume that you want to be a little bit higher than the lower notes. If you're using arpeggios, articulate with a pattern, have some kind of progression in volume if you're having a progression in notes. You're going from higher to lower, maybe start at a high volume and progress to a lower volume, or vice versa. And finally, accentuating notes sparingly. So you don't want to be accentuating every single bar. You want to mix up the articulations as you go. And in general, piano, you don't need to have loud velocities. They don't need to be high. They can be quiet in general, and that'll sound more realistic. So these 3 steps should help to make your pianos more real.